Okay, all right, we're back again. Today we're going to finish the reading of The Evolution of Species and Living Matter by Vladimir Vernadsky. It's the third and, I would imagine, final reading. Last week, if anybody listening on YouTube wants to follow up on the previous sessions, the previous workshops, they can do that by clicking on the links in the description box. The text to what we're reading is also going to be in the description box like usual. It is from a 2012 issue of 21st Century Science and Technology. This translation was translated by Meagan Rouillard. Vernadsky itself had written this, I believe, as an appendix within his Biosphere, but I could be wrong. The book from the 1928. Last week, we could do a little bit of a quick recap if we want, or just go straight into it. We just read here, as far as a quick recap, there were several key principles that Vernadsky zeroes in on when he's dealing with what is really animating the flow of living matter in time, as far as it relates to earlier species that have gone extinct to the present condition of human beings on the Earth, and the potential that we have going into the future as the first identifiable species defined by our choices, our free will, our choice to abide by wisdom or live according to folly. So we're the first species that has this power to do certain things that no other species has had access to. And in fleshing out what policies, because Vernadsky was also somebody who was in charge of a lot of science and industrial policy making of Russia, but he had networks in France, in Germany, in the United States, that were always interfacing with him. Some of his students led in the 1950s and 60s to usher in a revolution in optical biogeochemistry as well. The work on chirality, of different molecules that have the same molecular composition but have very different qualitative properties depending upon whether they're arranged in a left-handed or a right-handed way. This was a huge revolution that, again, his key students like Gauss, who was a key figure, ushered in, and the laboratories associated with the Vernadsky Institutes. Also another guy, Alexander Gurvich, who was the first person I think we know who really did serious work on the photons, the optical properties of cell mitosis, the organization of and the diversification of labor of cells within an embryo as it grows to a fully formed organism. And just how it is that the cells within different types of species of plants, of fruits, of other things communicate not simply through enzymes molecularly, but through light signatures, what are called ultra weak photon emissions. That there's certain very low frequency but very powerful light emissions constantly being emitted by all of our cells as a way to intercommunicate. This was, again, people like Gurvich, who was a student of Vernadsky, a collaborator, who opened up the door to whole domains that have been really obscured from current modern scientific inquiry. So he was looking at a lot. And anyway, Vernadsky was looking at, well, what are the properties, what were the principles and laws of nature that human beings can discover so that we can organize our own decisions about what future we want to bring into being policy-wise that are in accordance with nature. And of course, as we've gotten through in the previous sessions, as we just read here, some of the core principles of what causes some species to disappear while other species are created deal with a question of progress, which up until now, many people think, oh, progress, that's a purely human idea. Humans created the idea of progress, the idea of judging that certain policies are better versus other worse policies are worse because of certain things that we're often told is completely arbitrary, because what is better for one culture is worse for another culture. And so, it's all relative. And you got this relativism, which has really poisoned the discussion. But Vernadsky was saying, well, look, we're all human beings, regardless of what culture we're from or what religious, attributes we happen to abide by. We're human beings. And so is there anything that are universal constants, which is good for everybody? right? Regardless of the differentiation. And so looking at nature, we find, as he says here, the evolution of species from last week's reading, the evolution of species leading to the creation of new stable living forms must move in the direction of an increase of the biogenic migration of atoms in the biosphere. That's one of his fundamental laws. So that's a big one. How does that apply to human society, human economy, right? The question of human energy policy. Are there some energy decisions that we make that reduce the flow of the biogenic migration of atoms within the human ecology as well as the biosphere? Are there other forms of energy policy, or let's say water policy, that increase the flow of the molecules, the atoms within a system through the system and back out into nature and in a cyclical way? Are there things that go in one direction versus another that could be better or worse, and for what reason? These are questions to be kept in mind. Were there other principles here that we should zero in on before we continue on? You guys remember if there's anything that should be said before we read, or is that adequate? Oh yeah, I think this question of the Homo sapiens faber also, that he really hammers at the question that what defines human beings is not our biological makeup. It's really that we're the species that creates, that fabricates, right? So that even though there's similarities between human beings and like monkey biology, there's powers that the apes don't have access to, which humans do based upon this other metaphysical property. So that's another thing that's also very important to hold that in mind. And there's a thing with extremophiles too, I think, right? That there's that nature. You guys remember what he was saying about extremophiles? Because he was getting at the colonization thing.
What do you mean?
Basically, the idea was that biogenic migration was the process of expanding in space, and then when it was on the edges of those expansion, you would get those extremophiles that would pop up, and it would benefit or augment, the area of effect, if you wish, or it would help push forward farther, if you wish.
Yeah, the pioneers.
Yes, yeah, the pioneers.
Yeah, that everywhere you go, whether the depths, the bowels, the deep, dark, cold depths of the oceans, or even into volcanoes, hot, boiling volcanoes, or even into the upper atmosphere and even ionosphere, where life is not supposed to exist, we always seem to find, scientists are always surprised to find these forms of life that have adapted to very hostile environments, indicating, as Vernadsky says, that that nature always supersedes the limits to growth, that there's always this equilibrium, which causes the yearning for life to have a certain ubiquity to it, to spread to its fullest potential, but it can't beyond a certain limit based on the rules of nature. There's certain physical boundary conditions, but life, when it presses upon that, will be able to create solution concepts or solutions, biological technologies like chlorophyll that didn't exist at a certain point and then it existed, right? Cytoplasm, other things that didn't exist and then it existed, that allows for life to then overcome those limits and continue to push the threshold, which obviously has a lot of ramifications for how we see or how we deal with those who say human beings are overpopulated. There's limits to growth, right? We have to adapt to nature, adapt to the ecosystems. It's like, well, nature seems to be, constantly leaping beyond its limits when it's doing certain things in a certain way. Maybe we can do the same thing too, and maybe that's natural. Yeah, that was a big one.
Mhm.
All right. So let's go for number 10. Who wants to be today's reader? Pascal, Kevin, anybody?
I can read.
start.
Oh,
If you don't know, go ahead.
Jinx.
Go ahead.
Well, let's do two. You both. Yeah, let's do Declan and Pascal today.
Okay.
Who wants to start?
Yeah, I can start.
Okay.
All right. So number 10.
Yeah, let's do number 10.
Okay. It is certain that this principle cannot in any way explain the evolution of species and does not enter into the tentative explanations of the different theories of evolution which now preoccupy the great thinkers.
Wait, hold on, Declan. Before you go on, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Do other people detect that Declan's voice is getting really loud and really quiet? Okay.
Yes.
Do you have a speaker in front of you, Declan?
You mean like a should I just take off my headphones, you think?
Well, right now it's great, but maybe you could try that. Try to take off your headphones, see what it does.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Perfectly loud.
Okay, let me just adjust you guys.
All right.
Let's see. I'm having trouble with. Can somebody say something?
Something.
Hello.
Okay,
Hi.
here.
Was that good?
Yeah, there, that's better.
All right.
And I need to adjust my own volume. All right. So, starting from the beginning,
See.
it is certain that this principle cannot in any way explain the evolution of species and does not enter into the tentative explanations of the different theories of evolution which now preoccupy the great thinkers. This principle regards evolution as an empirical fact, or rather as an empirical generalization, and attaches it to another empirical generalization, that of the mechanism of the biosphere. But it is far from being indifferent from the point of view of the evolution of evolutionary theories, and it indicates, in my opinion, with an infallible logic, the existence of a determined direction in the sense of how the process of evolution must necessarily take place.
Okay, I am so sorry, Declan. It's doing it again. It wasn't the earbuds. It's something else. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
You're otherwise a great speaker, but for today, let's try to troubleshoot that one later on.
Okay,
Pascal, you're on.
Okay. Well, tell me if the sound was good.
Yeah, from you, it's fine so far.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. Okay. So I'll start back. First paragraph.
No, just go with but.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, page 41. Okay. But it is far from being indifferent from the point of view of evolutionary theories, and it indicates, in my opinion, with an infallible logic, the existence of a determined direction in the sense of how the processes of evolution must necessarily take place. This direction coincides perfectly in its scientifically precise terminology with the principles of mechanics, with all our knowledge of Earth's physical chemical processes to which biogenic migration strives. All theories of evolution must take into consideration the existence of this determined direction of the process of evolution, which, with the subsequent developments in science, will be able to be numerically evaluated. It seems impossible to me, for several reasons, to speak of evolutionary theories without taking into account the fundamental question of the existence of a determined direction invariable in the processes of evolution in the course of all the geological epochs. Taken together, the annals of paleontology do not show the character of a chaotic upheaval, sometimes in one direction, sometimes in another, but of phenomena for which the development is carried out in a determined manner, always in the same direction, and that of the increasing of consciousness, of thought, and of the creation of forms augmenting the action of life on the ambient environment. The existence of a determined direction of the evolution of species can be precisely established by observation. I will limit myself to a small number of general examples relative to the unfolding of processes of evolution, to paleontological indications considered from the point of view of the transformation of the biogenic migration in the course of geological epochs.
Okay. Yeah, that direction thing, I think we did read this last week because I got a lot of deja vu, but that directionality question, that's everything.
Yeah, that's actually the last chapter we read.
So it's really good that we reread that, because that's just, it's like, again, I think we established that last week. The Darwinian philosophy of evolution is that there is no directionality possible. It's ultimately randomized mutation that, causes life to move and new species to come into being in a race in a world of diminishing returns. So the tension is caused by the absence of resources. There's always this finiteness shaping and governing the how species modify themselves in the Darwinian world. It's absence of existence. Whereas in the Vernadskian view, and in the views of people like Karl Ernst von Baer, Cuvier, it's not a negation that causes change. It's the yearning for better. It's the yearning for, the fulfillment of potential. So it's a positive principle. It's not the absence of principle. It's not a vacuum. It's not emptiness. It's a very big difference, even though it's still tension, but it's what's causing the tension, right? It's a different universe.
All right. Can we say, Matt, that in that sense, I'm just reminded of Lamarck, who was, do you remember about Lamarck, or maybe we can talk about that later? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, let's talk about it later. I think John might have a word to say about that too. I've only read a little bit, but let's
Sure.
keep in that because we're gonna have discussion very soon. I think we're
Good.
almost on this essay.
All right. So I continue number 11. Yep.
Yo.
It was during the Cambrian period, at the limits of the ancient living world studied by us, when the higher invertebrates appeared. The fact in question is not absolutely established, but it is necessary to admit it to easily explain the sharp change which occurred shortly after the beginning of the Cambrian concerning the conservation of organisms. The complete immutability in the course of the entire Precambrian period of the processes of erosion, their complete identity, if we consider their essential traits with the analogous processes now, does not permit us to find the explanation of the absence of fossil remains in the different conditions of the surrounding environment. There is not, at the same time, any reason to suppose that the metamorphosis of Earth's geological layers occasioned by a determined duration of their processes had, following in this precise moment, an absence of organic fossils. It would otherwise be necessary to admit that all the oldest layers were completely transformed. Now, we are quite familiar with the cases where the Precambrian layers were less metamorphized than those of the Cambrian and those of the more recent times. It is probably the geologists who here admit of a sharp change of the biogenic migration of atoms of calcium who are right. It is the first phenomenon of this type which we could establish. It is possible.
Can you read the caption under the image with the birds?
Yeah. So just under the image, it says feathers incorporate calcium in addition to phosphorus, I guess. The activity of birds greatly increased the biogenic migration of phosphorus. Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And just question, can you read that one too? This caption?
Sorry, under the, oh yeah, okay. Photosynthesis caused a significant increase of the biogenic migration of carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen.
Okay. Okay.
Good.
And do people have an idea of when he says Cambrian? Do people have an idea of what's so meaningful with the Cambrian terminology, or that period in time, whenever that might have been?
No.
Oh, that's when life began?
Well, that's like sort of we won't assume that that's when life began necessarily, but that's when it got really interesting. So things before a certain time in the fossil records, and there's there's dispute about how to quantize the time frame of the fossil records. So we'll stay away from the numbers specifically, but when the further you go back, there's a moment where things get just very diverse and rich. And that Cambrian period is that moment. Before that, there's a lower order of diversity and change within the Earth.
If you accept the standard chronology, we're talking sometime around 600 million years ago, and there's a huge explosion of what appears to be much more complex multicellular life, with a whole pile of chordata that don't exist. It's as if there was a whole bunch of experiments done by nature, and many of them with time, with whatever following cataclysms, disappeared. But nevertheless, so we're talking approximately 600 million years ago, if you accept the standard time frame.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
I shall continue. It is possible that a similar modification of the biogenic migration of calcium caused by the formation of new species endowed with skeletons rich in calcium carbonate corresponds with the invasion of life into new domains of the biosphere. This modification must have had equal repercussions in the history of carbonic acid. We can get an idea of the importance of this event by remembering the role played in the biosphere by the organisms which are very rich in calcium, the organisms containing it in fundamental preference to other metals, in the formation of the calcium deposits. The mechanism of the biogenic migration of calcium experienced great changes during the indicated time, and this migration became instantly more intense. In order to judge it by that which we know of the intensity of the migration of calcium, sparked off by the creation of the higher invertebrate skeleton, for example, that of mollusks or of coral, in relationship to those of the microscopic organisms whose calcium is released in the end by water. It is necessary to admit an extreme and sudden augmentation of the intensity of its migration since the creation of these new forms of life. At the beginning of Paleozoic life, and maybe at the Cambrian period, another very important fact relative to the biogenic migration of atoms calls itself to our attention. It is a radical transformation of the sylvan vegetation of the continents. The process of gradual perfection of these organisms, of which the full blooming seemed to be attained, its point culminating in the tertiary epoch, still prolonged itself in the course of further geological epochs. This process corresponds to the conquest by life of a new and immense domain, that of the troposphere. The appearance of forests, exuberant with life, brought about a great change in the migration of atoms of oxygen, of carbon, of hydrogen, and simultaneously in that of all the living atoms, of which the cyclical movement, first of all, had to become more intense, because the forests, especially the forests with leafy trees, persisting through new geological epochs, concentrated life as much vegetable as animal, in proportions unknown of up until then. If we compare from this point of view the spore-bearing forests of primitive times to our tertiary forests of seed-bearing trees, the difference of the intensity of the biogenic migration will seem enormous to us. During the Mesozoic epoch, a new fact, the appearance of birds, augmented the intensity of the biogenic migration of atoms, and life again enlarged its domain. It was not until the Mesozoic epoch and the Tertiary epoch that flying organisms attained their fullest development in the form of birds. Two very important biogeochemical functions attach themselves to these two new forms of life. We can hardly conclude that there is a relationship between these forms and the flying invertebrate which emerged very long ago, around the beginning of the Paleozoic. Although these flying invertebrates, in particular, had fulfilled these functions and fulfill them still to this day. In any case, only the creation of the birds gave an impetus to the mechanism of the biosphere which it had not had earlier. In the mechanism of the biosphere, in the biogenic migration of atoms, the birds, as well as the other flying organisms, play an immense role for the exchange of matter between the solid earth and the water, principally between the continent and the ocean. The role of the birds differs from that of the rivers, but as far as the quantity of mass transported, it comes close. The migrations of birds renders this role even more important in that which concerns the biogenic circulation of atoms. The appearance of these species of winged vertebrates not only created new forms of biogenic migration that affected the chemical balance of the sea and of the continent, but it also provoked a new wave of biogenic migration in the course of the history of discrete bodies, in particular for that of phosphorus.
Okay, just quick for the footnote 10. I guess this is from the translator who cites from Mark McGeneman's Hypersea, quote, "The first aspect of Vernadsky's law involves actual transport by the motion of living organisms, such as the migration of phosphorus atoms from sea to land when shorebirds leave their droppings inland. To a Vernadskyan, a seagull is phosphorus on the wing." End quote. Right, I guess, yeah, so that's one quick example of just how phosphorus, the atom, would not normally ever have a way to make it out of the sea where it is predominant, where it predominates, and deeper into land were it not for the appearance of the species of bird that came about at that time that he talked about. I wonder what other examples there are of such things, of different other elements that wouldn't normally. Yeah, it's a good mental challenge. We don't have to come up with answers right now, but it's a good question. Like, what other elements of the periodic table had their cycles changed because of things like birds or other species?
I guess frogs would be a good subject and investigation on that front.
How so?
Well, they go from pond to land to pond, so they go in and out of water.
Oh, right.
Basically, just like seagulls, because in here Vernadsky seems to be, or actually the comment seems to be specifically talking about seabirds, right? And not the land birds, if there's such a thing.
Right. Well, one thing that's good to keep in mind is the metaphor he gave in the previous week's reading of the whirlpool. Remember that it's good to train the mind to see not objects that look like bird or, bison or whatever, but to see things from the mind's eye as like a whirlpool, which has a medium, right? The whirlpool is in water. It's constantly sucking in molecules, it's processing them and then just spurting them out of the bottom. Now, in the case of living things, not only are the molecules coming in and leaving when we breathe and when we eat, but they're also being transformed in various ways, including radio, like some atomic ways too, inside the body. And they're leaving, oxygen is coming in, carbon is coming in, and what's coming out is carbon dioxide, and so many things like that. Hydrocarbons are created from the synthesis of individual elements that are brought in through food and other things into plants and what have you. So, or carbohydrates, I should say. So yeah, that not all species have the same ratios of elements that they're bringing in and leaving behind, right? And so to see each species and each individual as being kind of like that whirlpool, and to the degree that they're a life, that cycling is happening, and just like a whirlpool, when the life principle leaves, that cycling, it still looks like a bison, but it's dead. It's not going to have that same cycling. It's not breathing anymore. It's not eating anymore. It's like a whirlpool that stopped. It's a fun thought experiment to just try to do that.
I just had another idea. I just have to get it out. From the chaos theorist, right? There's this meme about the butterfly effect, right? That a butterfly flapping its wing can cause a tornado in another country, right? And it's all about randomness. So maybe a counter meme to that would be to find an example of a butterfly who expresses this function here that Vernadsky is talking about. I'm just throwing it out there like that.
Can you say a little bit more on that?
Well, it's just on the on the information warfare front, if you want, like the just throwing out ideas that how do you say it, that take control of another mode of thinking, another meme from another mode of thinking.
I see what you're thinking.
Reappropriate, that's what I mean.
Right.
To reappropriate a meme for.
Right. So it's not like the butterfly is creating tornadoes, but that the butterfly is kind of like a whirlpool, is what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Migrating atoms. The butterfly is migrating atoms.
Mm-hmm.
There's something there. There's something there.
Changing the world.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I'm just, like I said, I'm just throwing it out there.
Okay. Accepted. Cool.
Okay. Yeah. I'm going to continue.
Yes, sir.
So just after footnote 10. The winged invertebrates, the insects, did not play as important a role. It is true that the flying saurians, reptiles, appeared before the birds, but everything indicates that they did not exercise actions comparable to theirs. The appearance of birds appears to be linked to that of new types of forests, or in any case, seems to have coincided with them. The role of civilized humanity, from the point of view of the biogenic migration of atoms, was infinitely more important than that played by the other vertebrates. Here, for the first time in the history of the Earth, the biogenic migration, due to the development of the action of technology, was able to have a greater significance than the biogenic migration determined by the mass of living matter. At the same time, the biogenic migrations change for all of the elements. The process was rapidly affected in a relatively insignificant amount of time. The face of the Earth transformed itself in an unrecognizable way, and yet it is clear that the era of this transformation has only just begun. These transformations conform to the data of the second biogeochemical principle. The change led to an extreme growth of the intensity of the biogenic migration of atoms in the biosphere. It is necessary to note here two phenomena. Firstly, man, and this cannot be doubted, is born of an evolution. And secondly, in observing the change which he produces in the biogenic migration of atoms, we note that it is a change of a new kind, which with time accelerates with an extraordinary rapidity. We can then perfectly admit that the changes in the biogenic migration of atoms were effected in the course of paleontological periods under the influence of the creation of new animal and vegetable species in a manner which is no less rapid. The new quantitative form of the biogenic migration, corresponding to civilization, was prepared by the entirety of paleontological history. We would have been able to recover its first fossil remains if we had known the laws of nature from the first pages of the Annals of Paleontology. I stop myself here on several typical phenomena with respect to the evolution of species relative to the biogenic migration of the chemical elements. In all these cases, the agreement of evolution with the second biogeochemical principle is evident, as it always seems to manifest itself in the analysis of the paleontological annals. How did this agreement occur? Does it follow from a blind combination of circumstances, or, indeed, from a more profound process determined by the properties of life, incessant processes, always the same in their manifestations in the course of the entirety of the geological history of the planet? The future will decide this. The regulating influence of the second geochemical principle will manifest itself in these two cases. Even if the evolution of species happened randomly, accidentally, outside of the influence of the ambient environment, that is to say, the mechanism of the biosphere, a species which was accidentally created would, however, not have been able to survive and to enter into the whirlpool of the planet. At the same time, only the species which were sufficiently stable and susceptible of augmenting the biogenic migration of the biosphere would have survived.
Okay, that's just a very important point as well, just to keep that in your mind, which I really like, because it's like this idea that every single thing that comes into being has a purpose to play within the biosphere, that it comes into being for a reason. It's not random chance that could be allowed for the cause of any species. It's because, right? It's because each part has a role to play in a broader symphony. It's like it's a much more coherent idea of why species exist than what you get with the Darwinians, who just try to make it seem as though the biosphere is the whole. It's the sum of the parts, right? And the idea of how the whole biosphere is being shaped by, but also shapes the what species go that no longer have a purpose and which ones come into being, you know, that now have a role to play in increasing the biogeochemical energy of the biosphere of the whole, which has increasing requirements. That's a really important concept. But it also puts in the question as well the context of the biosphere as itself being a whirlpool, like the biosphere as a system within the solar system, right? Which is itself shaped and has a role to play, our sun, right? And our system, like Michael Claridge gets at in his videos or his lectures at the Rising Tide Foundation, that each planet has qualities that are necessary for the entire solar system's health and harmonics. And thus you could say each sun would have a role to play within the galaxy, within the Milky Way. And each galaxy would have a role to play within the broader constellation of galaxies that it finds itself in, right? I just want to throw that out there.
That's pretty heavy.
Yeah, and then inversely, you could say that whole process is having a direct impact on what individual species we see coming into being. You know, it's not just the biosphere; it's the entire system of the universe, effectively, which is having a reciprocal relationship with every individual element within that universe of life and maybe even non-life.
Good.
Yep.
Okay, go on.
If you'd like.
Sure. Okay. It is, however, impossible to now oppose in an elementary fashion the organism in its environment, that is to say, the biosphere, as was done of old. We know that the organism is not an accidental inhabitant of the environment. It participates in the complicated mechanism and submits to fixed laws. Evolution itself constitutes a part of this mechanism. The naturalist must exclude all the philosophical or religious notions which have penetrated science from the outside, from his conception of the universe. For example, admitting the idea of the independence of the organism from its environment and of an opposition between these two factors would be a great error of this type. From this point of view, there truly exists an intimate connection between the agreement of evolution and the principle which governs it. And it is by no means a question of a simple confluence of circumstances.
Okay, that's the end of number 11. I think number 12 is the last one. Did anybody have any questions or any thoughts that stemmed from some of the ideas he threw out there for section 11?
I kind of see that, like he said, when species has a purpose and a role, that's why, like, even sometimes we see the earth or whatever, some other element comes in and really supports something that may be having, it's fighting or not fighting, but I kind of always notice something intervenes in certain history where they get support, like the earth comes and almost supports them. Not some outside force. Am I making sense? Like, because it has a purpose and a role, everything in nature comes and helps it when it's has to maybe having problems, adapting in a certain way, but it adapts because all these other elements comes to their aid.
Well, there's definitely, I mean, there's definitely a question of a harmony in nature and a question of cooperation, which is often overlooked when people get too focused on how everything is in a fight with everything else for a struggle to survive, and they miss all of these points of harmony and cooperation, which also are very observable, and if not anything more important than the Hobbesian battle of each against all. That's important. Yeah. There's a point here that he also says that I really liked when he says we can then perfectly admit that the changes in the biogenic migration of atoms were affected in the course of paleontological periods under the influence of the creation of new animal and vegetable species in a manner which is no less rapid. Describing here his, the increased biogenic migration. And that's something I always took for granted, like that human beings actually, that there's a lot of things which we think of as being like natural, which wouldn't exist were it not for human beings. So we have these like cornfields behind our house, and it's like, where in nature would you have corn? First of all, where would corn just exist in nature without human beings? It's like it wouldn't. There's corn as we know it is directly the effect of generations of selecting, choosing, and breeding the best seeds to get the most nutrient tasty effect possible. And that's why we have corn. In nature, corn is like this really inedible, teosinte crap. It's useless. So and then like apples and melons and bananas and all the stuff we take for granted as being there in nature. It's like none of that stuff was naturally there with early humans. This is stuff that was, or like, domesticated animals or pigs. All of these things just wouldn't be there if it weren't for human thought, shaping and causing them to come into being. So that's, it changes again how we think of like pristine nature and how human beings have increased a certain relationship between new species that we create and then the entire biosphere, which relates to that new species.
I was just wondering when he published all this, I guess in Russia or Ukraine, what was the public perception of all this?
No idea.
Being a newly communist society, they're kind of atheists.
He has to walk a fine line. Like there are repercussions for saying things that are outside of a certain, I mean, he has to be kind of careful. I know that he was, from what we've talked about, he was, as a young man, a leader and founder of the Constitutional Democrats in 1912. He was an admirer of Lincoln. His father was a translator of Henry C. Carey and Friedrich List. So he came from a certain cultural matrix in Russia that that had a direct continuity with the American Revolution, with a lot of really principled processes. His teacher was Mendeleev. He was one of the best students of Mendeleev, and a variety of really amazing Renaissance scientists of Russia in the 19th century. So he was really carrying on a big torch. And I know during the Bolshevik Revolution, he left he was in France studying at the Curie Institute. He was very close friends with Madame Curie. But you know, he also won the Stalin Prize. Like he became the most. I think he was like among the most renowned and important scientists of Russia throughout the 1930s and 40s, especially in the buildup of the productive industrial policies that Russia needed to develop in order to stand on its own 2 feet and to fight fascism. He played a key role in all that, and was the father of in many ways Russian atomic science. He played a key role in a lot of these developments. So, but I don't know about the masses. I don't know about how the population understood him. I don't know how that worked.
I would like to point out a discussion we had last week. Pascal pointed out something. I think it was about chapter 9 or section 9. The section where he talks about, for the first time, the directionality of progress, or the biogenic migration. And basically what we were saying is that it was basically a slap in the face for the Darwinists. But we were also saying that he seemed to be saying it in a roundabout way, like turning around the pot without, you know, telling it like it is. And Pascal pointed out that, well, in those times, like Kelly pointed out, it was the Bolsheviks were in power, and they were atheists, so we couldn't go just out there and make a theological argument. So we had to, like I just said, go at it in a roundabout way, turning it around the pot. Yeah.
Yeah, like you could see he definitely has a strong theology. He has a strong metaphysics, but he won't use a very obvious, literal, metaphysical language when speaking. It's almost like he's trying to trick the atheists into developing a theology. And also, I think he's also trying to talk to people who are religious but weak on science, to become more rigorous in their thinking too. He's trying, I think, he's always, you know, intervening on not just one group. He's always trying to intervene on a variety of groups at the same time. Which is, yeah, I mean, you know, we talk about that later. But that's, I was going to say, that's usually what you find a lot of the greatest scientists are doing, you know, because they know that you need to have both, right, a faith, right, in creation, a faith in creation's laws and the lawmaker, but at the same time you have to have the ability to really be rigorous with your material, to be able to both see the forest and the trees at the same time, you know, and not just focus on one or the other. And for people who just focus on the trees and the quantitative analysis, they tend to become a little, you know, Cartesian logic heavy, and they kill their ability to have that playful spirit, the simplicity of just having a simple faith. And a lot of people will go the other road and just say, no, all I care about are the simple principles. I don't care about, you know, wasting my time with details. And it's like, no, you're going to get your ass kicked in any intellectual debate, and do a lot of harm to the religion that you're trying to defend. If people, that's what the Darwinians capitalized on, right? When Thomas Huxley was arranging all of these debates, defending Darwinistic theology, you could call it, against the Anglican theologians, he made these public debates, and he always selected his opponent, who's a loudmouth know-it-all, priest or something, who he would be able to obliterate because they didn't know their science. And that's it, you know? And Christianity took the biggest hit.
Do you need a reader for point 12?
Sure.
Can you make it a bit bigger? Because I'm on a small screen.
How small? Don't you have the big screen?
It's also not actually showing up that big on the big screen.
Oh, okay. How's that?
Yeah, it's fine.
All right.
without preoccupying ourselves with the causes of evolution, while only indicating the necessity for it to have a determined direction. The study of biogeochemical phenomena thus circumscribes the domain of evolutionary theories admissible into science. It seems that this study opens before us yet another domain of the phenomena of scientific activity, until now exclusively reserved to the speculations of philosophy or religion. The new form of biogenic migration, at least new to this scale, was provoked, as we see, by the intervention of human reason. However, it does not distinguish itself in any of the other manifestations of biogenic migration, which are connected to other vital functions. We can at the same time establish in a precise way that human thought changes in a sharp and radical way the course of natural processes and modifies that which we call the laws of nature. Consciousness and thought, despite the efforts of generations of thinkers and wise men, cannot be reduced to either energy or matter, however we define these bases of our scientific thought. How can consciousness act on the work of natural processes, which seem to be entirely reducible to energy and matter? This question was last posed by the American mathematician A. Lotka, precisely on the question of biogeochemical phenomena. It is doubtful that his response was satisfactory, but he indicated the importance of the problem and the possibility of tackling it. It is probable that we will not be able to resolve this question until after having radically changed our fundamental physical notions, notions which have undergone and still undergo transformations with a rapidity for which we know of no prior examples in the history of thought. The physical theories will inevitably have to concern It is in this direction
Cynthia,
that thought now works, and it is impossible not to.
Cynthia?
Yeah. Yes. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Can you hear me now?
I could hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, our internet connection isn't the best. Should I continue? If it happens again, I'll be replaced.
Okay, but could you go back 2 sentences?
Where did it? Yeah, just tell me where that was though, because I don't know where I cut off.
Am I right to say the physical theories?
Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
The physical theories will inevitably have to concern themselves with the fundamental phenomena of life. It is in this direction that thought now works, and it is impossible not to take into account these new and profound researches, among them the speculations of the mathematician and English thinker, Alfred Whitehead. It is true, more philosophical than scientific merit analysis. It is very possible that another English thinker, J. Haldane, was right in predicting in the near future a radical transformation of physics and its principles due to the introduction of the study of life phenomena into its sphere. The study of biogeochemical phenomena, pushed to the forefront, allows us to precisely penetrate this domain of the connected manifestations of life and the structure of the physical universe, and at the same time, future scientific theories. This makes clear the profound philosophical interest which biogeochemical problems now present. Why do you think he named Whitehead?
Well, he's dealing with his living contemporaries who are, have a certain amount of, I think, prestige. And I don't know whether he saw some virtue in Whitehead's theories or whether he was being diplomatic. Same thing for Haldane. Haldane is worse in my view than even Whitehead. I don't know. But yeah, maybe he thought he could. He's very polite, as many of these scientists are, right? Like even Leibniz with all of his opponents, he's super polite. Though you know that he's like doing battle. and trying to like fight over who's going to, this word now exists, but there's a battle over like, how are you going to define the word? So I don't know. But I didn't read enough Whitehead either to, like, I don't know what theories specifically he's thinking of when he's saying this. Whitehead wrote a lot of stuff. Probably having to do with the, his fake, you know, because he had sort of a pseudo Leibnizian view of a monadology in his pantheism thing, that all life has sort of consciousness. Not all life, sorry, all existence, all matter and life has consciousness, even non-living things. And with that comes a certain yearning. And there's something attractive to that idea, right? But I think in the Whitehead interpretation of that, it's super anti-Leibnizian. There's no principle organizing the yearning towards better or worse, right? It's just complexity, quantitative complexity, kind of like what Pierre Teilhard de Chardin is also doing with Chardin's approach to creating a noosphere idea. Is that it's complexity that's pulling us. It's not better or worse per se, it's complexity. And Satomi, I don't want to raise the question. I'm just saying, like, there are these currents of thought. You could say Huxley instead if you want. Haldane as well is a eugenicist who's also got he's like a neo-Darwinian who's with the Huxley's or the Aldous or Julian Huxley school, trying to create a new Darwinian synthesis that allows for directionality, but towards complexity, not towards perfectibility, which is everything. Because that's the heart of transhumanism. That yeah, there's the singularity point, right? That's pulling us like a spirit. We have no free will because this moment in the future is pulling us. And that moment is the moment that there's this singularity, and different people interpret the singularity differently, where human beings either, you know, merge with machines to become superhuman, or, you know, whatever. There's this new, but that's what the transhumanists are also pushing for. And the elites are then the ones who are going to govern the levers of evolution, and they will control the natural selection of the test tube babies and CRISPR breeded cows, you know, into the future. I would like to see somebody do a bit of like an essay on this though, directly, especially with bringing in Whitehead.
You mean on Vernadsky?
Yeah, like the different approaches. Yeah, like to the, because Vernadsky also obviously believes that a future point is driving the present, as do all great thinkers, right? St. Augustine with the City of God is of the view that there's this birth of a just city of justice and love and goodness that is driving as sort of a blueprint humanity. But then you have the evil guys who also have a similar view that a future point is governing us, but it's governed by very different parameters. And there's similarities on the surface.
Yep, every lie always has a grain of truth. That's why it's believable.
Yeah, that's the way they work so damn well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh, Pascal left. Huh. Yeah, I was hoping to hear his thoughts on.
We are 4 people in this one avatar, so Pascal's here.
Yeah.
Oh, Pascal's there. Oh, okay. Hey, Pascal, what was that you were going to say about Lamarck? And
I was not sure actually. I had to review it, but I remember having being in a classroom and being told by some professor in university that Lamarck was really stupid because he thought that the evolution was for a purpose, and so the real evolution was really the one that Darwin, you know, the Darwinian version of it.
not for any reason, but just because it was just better, just adapting better. But I don't remember exactly the details, so I that's why I asked the question. I'm not sure exactly, but I remembered that Lamarck was seen as not as great, or just not looking at evolution in the right way.
Hmm.
And I was wondering how what was Vernadsky's view on that.
He cites Lamarck. In many of his essays, he's citing Lamarck.
Right.
John wants to speak.
I thought John would have a thought or two.
Of course.
Am I muted or not? Or am I? Hello, everyone.
Hello.
This is John.
Hello.
Woken up.
So on the question of Lamarck, Lamarck was anything but an idiot. He had the misfortune of having an eulogy done by Buffon on his graveside, and Buffon did a hatchet number on him, and pretending to praise him, essentially destroyed his credibility. So quite despicable thing. You're supposed to say no evil of the dead. Well, he definitely said evil of the dead right in front of him. In his Philosophie zoologique, Lamarck describes the basic principles of evolution the way he understood them. An organism is put under stress. And so that organism prepares itself to adapt. So it literally puts itself into a different mode, allowing itself to adapt, potentially. It doesn't necessarily do so, but it increases the chance that it will adapt. And possibly it does adapt and change. And possibly some of these changes are then inherited by progeny, by the descendants. Now, after the introduction of the synthetic model of evolution in the 1920s, combining genetics and Darwinism into a single so-called coherent whole, which isn't. All it did was replace God with a capital G with a chance with a capital C. Lamarck was really, really disparaged. But people working with bacteria have in fact demonstrated that that is exactly what bacteria do to evolve. So single-cell organisms go through mitosis, and what happens is that in times of stress, the spell checker, which is ensuring the proper replication of DNA, is turned off selectively by the organism on certain parts of the genome. It literally chooses which parts of the genome will be allowed to adapt and which parts will have the full spell check. So that is exactly an example of Lamarck in action. So he was anything but an idiot, and he didn't know anything about bacteria, of course. It's just that his basic principles that he put forward turned out to be correct.
I thought there was something to do with intention too. Like I remember when I was in high school, my teacher as well disparaged Lamarck quite a bit, and she gave the example of how stupid he was to think of the giraffes, right? And how giraffes
want to be taller. Giraffes want to be taller, and that's kind of stuff. I heard exactly the same criticism of Lamarck, so they must have all come from the same source, despite the fact that I think must have been stupid giraffes that were telling the story. They didn't remember what actually happened to their ancestors, so they invented a myth. I haven't fully read Philosophie zoologique. I have read the passages that I just mentioned to you, both in English and in French. And I know of no such thing where it's simply, if I want to be taller, I'll be taller. If I want to be shorter, I'll be shorter. If I want 7 toes instead of 5, they'll get 7 toes. I've never read any of that stuff in Lamarck's actual writings. I think that's just a red herring. False, the kind of stuff that Buffon did on his graveside.
Buffon was living up to his name.
Well, Buffon was if you look at his drawings, he makes Audubon look like a high school kid. And he was an astonishing natural illustrator, but that's a different story. That's all I have to say for the moment.
Question on epigenetics. John, can you, what role does Lamarck play in the development of epigenetics?
I really don't know. I really don't know.
Okay. Right.
Lamarck is an astonishingly controversial figure, and there was a British-born Australian academic who worked for many years at the University of Wollongong. The name escapes me. I can find it later.
Okay.
Who took up, I think he actually did his PhD at the University of Toronto, so he passed through Canada as well. So he took up the gauntlet to defend Lamarck. I have his book, but it's in a box inside a storage area, and I have no idea where it is.
Gotcha. Okay.
Cheers.
Thanks.
The name is Ted Steele. Steele. Lamarck's Signature is the title of the popularized book.
Okay.
So
Right.
that's an easy title to remember. Lamarck's Signature.
What one thing I'd really like as well to get a handle on, and I haven't been able to find it yet, but it must be there, is if what years was Vernadsky in Russia in the 20s, right after the revolution, because that was a period when Trotsky had a lot of influence and power, especially over science and industrial policy in the early 20s. And if Vernadsky was in Russia, did he have any? If he had influence at that time, which he must have, would he have had also any confrontations or disputes with Trotsky? I'd really like to know, because Trotsky was doing a number on Mendeleev, trying to make Mendeleev seem like he was something that he wasn't. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. Just speaking out loud or thinking out loud. So what what I think I'd really like to do, as I mentioned last week, would be now that we have a sort of introduction to Vernadsky and his method, and you know his basic laws of biogeochemistry, would be to now shift gears and look at some essays by Henry C. Carey and maybe one or two speeches by Lincoln, which and then look for the exact same things we just read over the last 8 weeks in Vernadsky. Look to see where these same ideas express themselves in their own way in a few essays by one of the leading figures of the Whig Party and then later Republican Party of the United States in the 19th century, which then had certain collaborators active within Russia developing the Trans-Siberian Railway, modeled on Lincoln's Transcontinental Railway, who were translating his works. As I mentioned, Sergei Witte, the transport minister and prime minister later on of Russia, who spearheaded the development of Russia's rail policy and also national banking policy that it was sabotaged before it could properly blossom. But he was a massive follower of Hamiltonian economics, Friedrich List and Henry C. Carey. And Mendeleev himself, was on the committee of the protective tariff, fighting British free trade from St. Petersburg, while making his discoveries in science in Russia. So there's this beautiful synergy between the evolution or the growth of a science of political economy and all natural sciences that are co-developing. And so science as economics as science, or politics as science, it hasn't happened yet but it's like we've been moving towards an actual science of statecraft for a long time that fuses the best of what human beings are at, as far as we are a species that is artistic, that is creative, that can apply that power of creativity in whatever scientific endeavors, that has application in mechanical, the mechanics in industrial policy, which is a testing ground for pure ideas. So, how do you know if your idea that you have as a fun solution concept is right or wrong? How do you prove it's right or wrong? How do you test it? Well, you got to do things in the real world, right? You need an economic policy that allows you to test ideas and see which ideas are better or worse, which ones do the job, which ones cause the universe to resonate to your idea in a way that improves your power to sustain more life at a higher quality, and which ideas might have looked beautiful or at least attractive, but are actually worthless when you try to do anything, like the God particle that they're now putting billions of dollars again into investigating in the CERN particle accelerator. It's like, shit, guys. Like, we've poured probably hundreds of billions of dollars into this thing over the past decades, and we're going to pour in hundreds of billions more when we could be doing really great discoveries and feeding the world a million times over.
All they're going to do is just find more particles.
Yeah, guaranteed they're going to find more particles. Yeah. What use those particles will be, or how we understand what they are that we're looking at, we'll have no idea. They have no mental power to judge what the hell they're looking at. They're just blowing shit up.
What does it mean to discover a particle in a particle accelerator?
Bragging rights.
So
Bragging rights, huh?
no. So what you see are these probabilistic paths resulting from these cataclysmic high energy explosions, and these streaks on various recording devices, and then somehow there's this proof that there is a particle that has been developed. Well, it's perhaps not quite as clear as the public relations statements are. Maybe these aren't actually particles that are being, or maybe they are, but there's something else. So you have to be very careful about accepting these great public relations brochures. They make for wonderful statements. I think the true measure of whether this stuff were to be useful or not would be, is there new technology being developed as a result of these incredibly expensive high energy experiments? And if the answer is either clear no, or at least a doubtful, then that perhaps is making a statement about the underlying pure science, which is the basis for these experiments. Perhaps the whole edifice of particle physics is simply erroneous, but we wouldn't want to say that on this. Let's stay with Vernadsky.
Well, yeah, no, it's I think a very scary thing for some very powerful forces that that their entire edifice is premised on sand, on nothing. And if anybody tries to do anything and test out any of these ideas we have to worship, we would discover so quickly how useless and fake they actually are. It's very fragile. Which is why it gives me a lot of hope to see actual concrete goals, like large scale mega projects and goals to do things that we've never done before coming out of Eurasia, which is like they're actually doing something. They're not trying to degrowth or shut down industrial civilization to some, fictitious moment of stasis where we are in equilibrium with the ecosystem or something. They're not bothered. Like, that's not holding their thinking at all. And they're trying to do things. So it gives me a great hope that a lot of these lies in science, masquerading as science, are going to at least be disproven, if not by the theory, by the battle over the theory, by the at least the physics, the experimental physics, and the fact that they're doing things that should be impossible. I'd like to see more of that. That'll go far. And some breakthroughs in fusion would be nice too. But you can imagine that too, right? Like, I mean, what would it mean that we find life? I mean, there's what? There's 64 moons around Jupiter. There's, I don't know, 38 or something around Saturn. There's two moons around Mars. But I mean, there's just so much that has been unexplored in our own local environment in the solar system, right? And just imagine that we started finding different interesting expressions of bacterial or other forms of life, and that would help definitely expand the mind from thinking of life as being just something that randomly just happened here on the sweet spot here on Earth, to being something which is more universal. Life is something which is, you know, it would change how we think of the nature of the universe and life within it if we were to do that by having it. But we can't do that in the West because we don't have a space policy that's just trying to do anything except, you know, weaponize space in some preparation for nuclear war. We don't have any serious, we've shut down all of our advanced tech as far as space tech goes. Back in the 1970s, we annihilated it. So if anyone's going to do that, it's going to be Eurasia leading that. But that would be a big creative flank. I mean, it's up there too with like Kepler, who discovered that, you know, that there's a principle of harmonics of music organizing the behavior of the planets around the sun. What a beautiful idea that is in the middle of a dark age, like where it's essentially a dark age. I mean, he was living in the middle of the 30 Years' War, right? Not a lot of reason for hope or optimism. The population is mostly mercenaries who have jobs. If you have a job, you're mostly a mercenary. Otherwise, I mean, you know, Germany lost I don't know what percentage, but a huge percentage of its adult male population was wiped out. So there was a lot of despair, a lot of stupidification. Empire had gained a lot of power. It didn't look like there was much opposition, but that concept, maybe Kepler didn't see it in his lifetime, but he knew that concept was a paradigm shifter, and it's true, it was. And they've been working for 400 years to keep that thing in the box. So very few people have actually read Kepler's works or appreciated the implications of the fact that we exist within the universe of harmony and music, and can discover said harmony as well, right? Which Vernadsky is directly an heir to that tradition.
I like to focus on, you know, improving the Earth, let alone going out to space. I mean, we have, wow, you know, when you think about the things that are going on, that we still have, we probably have the means, but we just don't have the will. And the people that do have the influence that can make changes, you know, I mean, I believe all the solutions are here, but we just are not, just like so many of the patents that have been suppressed by the pharmaceuticals, and like we've got enough things here on Earth to make it a heaven on earth, and we're, you know, I'd like to just focus on this because I love this planet. I think it's, you know, I mean,
well said, Tommy. Let me. One thing that I'm reminded of is, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. Made a point that you're often able to help yourself only when you help others, and so it's only when we get out of our self-referential state that we really find ourselves. Like our egos we escape the shackles of our ego as we extend our compassion to others, and we live more for something beyond ourselves. And then we find who we actually were the whole time. And I think it's like that also from this discussion of like, what's more important, like Earth or the galaxy or something, you know? And I think that we're going to find surprises if we could shift our gears as well to think about discoveries of this beautiful universe. We'll find all sorts of resources that we didn't realize we had access to the whole time to solve problems on Earth. It doesn't mean we just do that. I don't mean we should just like look at the universe and forget the Earth. I'm not trying to say that either. That would be bad. But
you know, there are people that want to move to Mars. I say, well, go ahead and move.
Yeah, but you know, if you actually have a program, if you're thinking like transgenerationally, like let's say we had an 80 or 90 year orientation towards, let's say, terraforming, right? That's not something we're going to see in our lifetimes. But let's say we get the ball in motion and we start doing things now that's going to make that happen. Well, part of what's involved is taking hostile environments, as we see on the surface of things like Mars, and figuring out a way to transform them to become habitable, supportive of life. Now that means like the ice caps on Mars we have to think about how do we maybe use those ice caps, maybe use the vapor that can be released to manufacture an atmosphere, or have an atmosphere that self-organizes by maybe helping that process. But to do all of those things requires looking at deserts here on Earth that we have to learn how to make green along the way. And we'll discover so much about how to do this elsewhere by first working in our own backyard and thinking, okay, well, how do we take California and make that blossom, right? How do we take the water into the Sahara and make that Sahara blossom like it used to blossom 5,000 years ago, right? Or what about the tundra, and like what about what Russia is doing with these new Arctic cities? They're building 5 advanced cities that's going to host 1 million people each under Sergei Shoigu's lead. The defense minister, like who's in charge of this project, that's going to involve supporting 1 million people in Siberian and far north climates. That you have to have some serious Arctic agricultural policy, right? You have to have some serious use of advanced nuclear science to make that work well. And obviously the applications that can have in sustaining, colonies on another planet or another satellite around, Mars or whatever, it's going to have huge playback. But you always think about the both.
Well, yeah, I understand what you're saying. Yes, some of the things that we might discover while we're exploring space, it will come and enhance the Earth as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I you understand that.
Yeah.
Something I really heard that I found amazing was that Greg Braden, there's an ancient Hebrew text that even the rabbis cannot decipher. Well, you know how letters and numbers have numbers and numbers have letters, and anyways, it's kind of hard for me to explain, but what he was able to decipher was that in the DNA, when the numbers were translated into letters, you know what it said? Every DNA,
Rosebud.
the eternal God within the body. No, I'm going to have to find the eternal God within the body in our DNA.
I mean, that's I have to be persuaded quite a bit with this stuff, but yeah, there's a lot. I said I have to be persuaded with quite a bit before I nod my head in agreement. I don't know, but
well, I can't explain.
I'm not asking you to. I'm just saying it's there's a lot that's definitely suppressed, and there's a lot of beautiful ideas that have already been born that we have not had the right to discover, and a lot of new beautiful ideas that have not had the chance to be born yet. But I think that if people can have a chance to study Vernadsky, and a lot, just get, if that was part of our school system, we're not allowed to read this in most Western universities or even high schools where we should have an introduction. I mean, you would see very powerful minds at all over the place, making all sorts of discoveries of things that we're told are impossible to discover, or, anyway, yeah, there'd be some.
It's really amazing when I hear Vernadsky. I mean, he just demolishes Darwin, but yet he's just like a footnote when it comes to.
Oh, if that.
What we know.
Yeah, absolutely.
To me, truly.
It's good. It's good.
You ever hear him in a debate? No.
Never.
Yeah.
So what we'll do next Wednesday, if all goes well, I'll not if all goes well, things will go well. I'm going to scan Henry C. Carey's a few of the essays, the better ones. They're all great, but I'll try to find 3 or 4 good ones. We'll start reading that next week, and it'll go from there. Okay, guys.
Matt, I just want to say thanks very much for doing Vernadsky, because I never heard of him, and this little sessions that you did about it really got on this whole biogeochemical energy. I think it really got the mind thinking in terms of energy and how we could use it to direct natural processes and create big change in the direction of positive progress, you know, for the entire population. And you know, it just got my mind thinking these past few weeks on more on like how conservative, not even conservative use of energy, but thinking how energy is used on day-to-day processes, biologically or chemically, or and how we live in a really privileged time in history to have access to energy to use in many different ways that couldn't be done before. And I mean, looking at some of these Western policies, Europe and America, I think it really, to me as an outsider, like I don't even know what to think, because it's just not comprehensible for people like me, because it's more like regression, really, going back in time, and I mean, here in Trinidad too, in terms of energy, you hear more and more people say, with this whole climate agenda stuff, is like, people tend to think, well, we use natural gas and oil for the development of our economy, and not just that, but life itself, and to just switch without a proper transition, I mean, even the layman actually understands that will lead to a lot of destruction and pain. But it just sadly, I don't see that attitude in the West being predominant. But I really appreciate what you did here and these last few weeks, and I really learned a lot. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, man, for those great ending words. And yeah, Vernadsky is just such a gem. There's so much more to explore too. I mean, I'll make some. I'll make sure that his essays that we have hosted on the Rising Tide Foundation Library of Alexandria site are made widely available. So there's so much more to explore, especially on his work on the noosphere, which we only touched on indirectly. And as from that very last section, what you just said, Vernadsky was really hammering at that in a clear way, that, well, thought itself and consciousness are not themselves matter or energy per se, but they're the things that cause energy and matter to change in time. Like, they're the causal agencies. So how could ideas, is basically what he's saying. How is it that we could understand the nature of categories of ideas, of mind, be what shapes the material world, if mind is something which is transmaterial, right? Because it's not like you could take an idea of justice and chop it in half, or chop it in 4 pieces, and like, okay, you take half of justice and I'll take half of justice. That's not how thoughts work. But justice, you wouldn't say it doesn't exist. All of human civilization has been shaped around people who battled over divergent ideas of justice, or right and wrong and truth, right? So the mind itself is shaping matter, and it's just such a wonderful, fresh way of looking at nature, by looking at the role of mind and purpose and reason in shaping all of the organization of nature, including especially human beings as the first self-referential expression of this process, which was already there everywhere in the universe. It changes everything, and it really helps us. It gives you an edge when you're dealing with a confused, well-intended environmentalist who just, there's so many people who are just good people, and they're popular at, school brainwashing, and they really think that the cause of all of the wars and injustices were just overpopulated, or whatever. We built too many dams in California, and that's why there's problems in California, is we try to develop too much. And it's like, no. They're not evil, right? They're just confused. And so when you have these ideas that you have in your tool basket, it gives you such an edge to help them, than otherwise just saying, no, you're a fool. What are you doing? Stop it, slap out of it. That doesn't work. So yeah, it's a good thing, and it gives you something better, right? Because you don't want to just tell people that they're wrong if they think we're overpopulated. It's like, okay, well, can you prove why we're underpopulated? Why do we have too few people? Why do what makes human beings such an infinite resource? Why is growth actually unlimited? We're saying that there's limits to growth. Well, actually, why are we right? Why is there never a limit to growth? So it's good to be able to answer these questions to ourselves, and then we could test it out on other people when we have Platonic discussions with people who are still a bit confused. If they're dishonest, it doesn't work. You have to walk away.
Gee, Canada is a great example of why, you know, there's underpopulated.
Oh yeah, yeah. So much potential. All right, guys, it was always a pleasure. Till next week. Actually, for some people who come on Sundays, Adam Sedia is doing a thing on Ibero-American history from the standpoint of the pre and post Republican era, and some battles within the Habsburg Empire as well, between factions who wanted to enslave versus other factions who actually wanted to do good, which I don't know anything about, so I'm going to be curious to check that out. And that's Sunday at 2, and it will be recorded for those who cannot be there. Right? Bye, guys.
All right.
Bye. Thank you again.
See you guys.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks again.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.